Good evening. My name is Steve Glassman. I'm the CEO of the Design Center, and we are really thrilled that you're here this evening. We actually didn't expect to fill the theater, and we're really quite delighted that so many people have decided to come out to attend this wonderful evening's events. We are very appreciative to see so many of you here to listen to the wisdom of Dr. Mindy Fullilove here in Pittsburgh, and we're honored that so many organizations have joined us as co-sponsors for this event, in addition to the Laurel Foundation, whose generous support has made this lecture possible tonight. I would like to actually thank each of our organizational sponsors for their engagement and help in spreading the word about this evening's presentation. They are listed in your program, but they have been so helpful in gathering people from near and far to this lecture that I'd like to mention them tonight. First, of course, the August Wilson Center for African American Culture, the Green Building Alliance, who was inadvertently left off of the posters and postcards, GTEC, the Hill Community Development Corporation, Hill House Association, the Kingsley Association, Leadership Pittsburgh, Local Government Academy, Pittsburgh Community Reinvestment Group, Pittsburgh Parks Conservancy, the Pittsburgh Partnership for Neighborhood Development, Pop City, Remaking Cities Institute at the Carnegie Mellon University, Sustainable Pittsburgh, UXOR, the University Center for Social and Urban Research at the University of Pittsburgh, the University of Pittsburgh's Graduate School of Public Health, the Urban Redevelopment Authority of Pittsburgh, and Vibrant Pittsburgh. Please give us a hand in gathering these wonderful community assets together. Thank you. Before my board chair, Ken Doino, comes up to introduce Dr. Fullilove, I wanted to introduce you to the Design Center's newest program, Design Allies, which is funded by the Heinz Endowments and is now launching this week. There is a page in your program that deals with Design Allies. Its purpose is to advocate, educate, and engage the public in good design. It is modeled on successful programs in other cities, such as Philadelphia's Design Advisory Advocacy Group and Charlotte Civic by Design. We have created Design Allies with three goals in mind: to provide a regular forum for an independent and informed voice for quality design and planning, to connect citizens with dialogue about design and planning, to increase design literacy in our communities, and to create a culture of appreciation for good design and planning. Our plan for Design Allies is to attract a robust, diverse, and inclusive group of people to share ideas, to comment, to learn, and participate in making our neighborhoods, our city, and the Pittsburgh region an ever better place to live. We want everyone interested in our region to be part of this conversation. We want to attract individual residents, business owners, landlords, community activists, community-based organizations, community development corporations, as well as municipal planning and design staffers, nonprofit organizations dedicated to building strong, sustainable communities, and of course, design professionals, such as architects, landscape architects, engineers, interior designers, and graphic designers. Through Design Allies, we hope to encourage thoughtful public discussion about issues and opportunities affecting our community. Issues ranging from blight and vacant property, to cycling and trails, from business districts and main streets, to public art and cultural diversity, from historic preservation, to roads and bridges, as well as public policy related to planning and design issues and public hearings. Dr. Fullilove's lecture tonight represents one way we will further education and discussion about good planning and design. We will continue to provide these types of opportunities to all of you, and as we all realize, much of our communication and engagement is now virtual. Reports from the Pew Research Center actually continue to monitor the increased usage of social media across all demographics. So Design Allies will have a strong and timely social media presence through Facebook, Twitter, and blogs. We want to keep you up to date on the latest information, and we're interested in your comments about all of these issues. For example, a June 14th article from Atlantic Cities reported on a recently released American Planning Association poll. You can access this article now from Design Allies' Facebook page, and we'd like to know what you think through your comments. We want the content in our social media postings to be relevant and interesting to our followers. We've created a custom app for Facebook to help us do precisely that, and we are beta testing it here in Pittsburgh for Pittsburgh City residents. It will allow us to push out notifications about upcoming public meetings by email or text. So this week, we will be reaching out to you to become involved as a participant and a voice of Design Allies. You have started tonight by attending this lecture. Please continue tomorrow by going home and liking the Design Allies Facebook page. Thank you. As you all know, Pittsburgh has a great design ally in one of our leading architectural proponents, principal of Rothschild Doino Collaborative, Ken Doino, who is our board chair. They have provided some of the most original architectural solutions and urban planning and community-based design to Pittsburgh and the region. We are really thrilled to have Ken as our board chair, and he will now introduce Dr. Mindy Fullilove. Thank you.
Thank you, Steve, and thank you all for attending tonight. It is wonderful to see such a excited and full house. Cities are places where we choose to live in close proximity for both individual and shared benefit. And at the Design Center, we're very, very excited to be advancing how we do that. And in particular, as designers, we're often focused on what is the result going to be physically. But we recognize very much when we talk about community design that it also involves how do we work together to accomplish that. And so we were particularly thrilled to attract Steve Glassman, coming from the Human Relations Commission at the state level, to come and lead our organization almost a year ago to the day. So on behalf of the Transition Committee and the board, I would like all of you to just help me welcome Steve formally to the city of Pittsburgh. You're going to hear a lot about history today and how history informs where we are today. And to do that, you're going to have an expert guide who is going to give tremendous insight into how that comes together and how we bring our histories together to understand not just ourselves and our relationship to our histories, but the relationship to our city. Dr. Mindy Fullilove, who I'm really happy to be able to call my friend, Dr. Mindy Fullilove, was a doctor of medicine starting in 1978 and did a residency in psychiatry in 1982, and then spent the first 4 years of her career working in the San Francisco Bay Area, treating severe persistent mental illness in the community. One day she got a call from somebody who would become a future city council person in the city of Pittsburgh, Salah Uddin, who said, "Would you come and study AIDS?" And she said, "No." He said, "Well, how about having lunch?" So, as Mindy would say, this is one of those pivot points where everything changes. And indeed, Salah did attract her to understand that, and she went on to study not just AIDS, but studying crack epidemics and violence epidemics and the multi-disease resistant tuberculosis epidemics, and publishing and working within the field in all of these epidemics until she was recruited to Columbia University in 1990. So through all that time, she was working within the system, but as somebody studying and publishing, she was able to move to Columbia and the New York Psychiatric Institute with tenure, which gave her great latitude to actually do something that Mindy and I talk about a lot, going upstream. And this comes from the social work realm and the community psychiatry realm. When people are coming down the stream and you're pulling them out of the stream, eventually you need to run upstream to see who's throwing them in the water. And I'm glad somebody laughed, because she said, "This is a joke that we say." And I thought, that's a joke? I mean, I think so it's good that somebody laughed. So through those years, she continued to study this and go upstream, so much upstream that she actually almost went upstream out of her field, where people within her field were saying, "I don't know what you're doing, but it doesn't belong to our field. So whatever you're doing, that's fine." Fortunately, she had tenure. So she was getting funded through Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, the Centers for Disease Control, for some of that work. And now they say, you've got more work done, more work for pound, than anybody else. And she's thought of as doing really breakthrough work, but that was, at the time, work that was thought of as being out of the field. And that's an important lesson there, because there was a point in time where Mindy went to France and met with a very important urbanist, French urbanist, Michel Cantal-Dupart, and he started to teach her about cities and the environment and the manner in which cities were throwing people into the stream, if you will. And Mindy, in her own incredibly curious way, said, I need to understand this, I need to understand this, and continued to spend years and years learning French, going back and forth. And during that time, she also came to the city of Pittsburgh, which is an incredible blessing for us as a city. And she arrived here and was giving a speech at the University of Pittsburgh, and people from the Hill, some members of the community, said, you need to come, and we need you to come to our neighborhood and understand and help us understand our neighborhood. And that has led her to an incredible 15-year study, and she's going to talk a little bit about her 15 years here, understanding the city of Pittsburgh and how it has changed, and why where we are now is incredibly important, not just for our city, but for our country and for the world, as we seek to understand and reconcile and have cities that don't throw people into the water and into the stream. My particular path with Mindy started in 2009. We were invited to participate in the Hill District Master Plan competition, and I called Mindy to be on the team, having read Root Shock, her 2004 book, a couple of years earlier, and be very moved by it. And we developed a dialogue about what was necessary from a planning standpoint to employ in that setting. And that was the beginning of a dialogue that continues to this day. We've had many, many visits with each other back here in Pittsburgh. She was a key consultant in helping me understand our city better as we worked with the Almano partners in Hazelwood. And we've had the pleasure of beginning some work in Homewood and understanding some of the issues going on there to build off of some of the work that's happened at the URA there. And so any neighborhood that begins with an H, we're ready. In 2012, always going upstream, Mindy actually, most recently, completed her certificate in landscape design from New York Botanical Garden, and says this was much harder than medical school. So those of you who are designers and are resident in the field, you should feel appreciated by that and her continuous curiosity. Mindy lives in West Orange, New Jersey, about 6 blocks away from where she grew up. And growing up in the red zone, as you'll see as we talk about those zones. And it is a community now in the process also of community restoration, and she's a key part of that within her community. She has published 5 books, most notably for the city of Pittsburgh, Root Shock, but her 6th book I've had the pleasure of working with her intensely on, called Urban Alchemy, Restoring Joy to Our Fractured American Communities, which we think takes many lessons from Pittsburgh, also gives many challenges back to Pittsburgh, and brings challenges out to the rest of our country and the world in how we make a city that is a great place for all people. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Mindy Fullilove.
Hi, everybody. Hey. I can't see you, but hey. It's really a great honor that you all wanted to hear what I have to say on this topic of Pittsburgh's 21st century triumph over 20th century urban renewal. And I just want to say at the outset that many of you know me and know how much I love Pittsburgh and admire your city. But for many years, I admired it as a city that I criticized and thought was really going in a wrong direction. And now I want to say that I love your city, and the point of this is to say, I think you're really going in the right direction. And America needs you, and the world needs you, and I hope you'll keep going in that direction. I think that what's really important here is to, sorry, I hit it backwards. to start with my mother. Because if there's anything I've learned about Pittsburgh over these years, it's that Pittsburgh is a city of families and people who know each other and people who treasure connections and history. And so this is my mama Maggie when she was 1 year old. When she was about 7, the first black family moved into where she lived, Chippewa Lake, Ohio. And they had a little boy who walked her home from school. And a few days later, he came over, and she knew that he wanted to play. She was upstairs. She heard her dad call up, "Margaret, your little darky friend's here." And she knew she was not supposed to go downstairs and play with that boy. She was ashamed of this for the rest of her life. And when she was in college, she moved to Charlotte, North Carolina, and there became radicalized and began to have some tools for fighting racism. And we are very proud of many things in my mother's life, but this photograph of her on the NAACP board in Charlotte, North Carolina in 1942 just fills us with joy. My father, I am just pressing the wrong thing, sorry. My father, Ernest Thompson, at about the same age, at about 7, was raising sweet potatoes on his grandfather's farm when a white farmer's pig got into the field and destroyed his crop. It was the tradition in the countryside for a farmer to pay if an animal did damage like that. But the white farmer came and loaded his pig onto the wagon and refused to pay. My father was furious, so he ran inside the house and he got his grandfather's shotgun and came running out, and he pointed the shotgun at the man. This is in the South, he was about 7, in about 1915. His grandfather said, "Put the gun down, put the gun down." And he did, but he had a moment of understanding that it was possible to have power. And as part of the Great Migration, he moved north and became a leader of the union movement. And this is my dad on the Hudson County CIO Council. And what's important in this picture is that both of my parents stepped over the color line. In the union movement, they met each other, and they got married. Notice the tie. And then there was little me. What my parents were trying in their lives, in their lived experience, in their political work, in their dreams, was to undo what historians and urbanists, Jane Jacobs, Tom Hanchett, have called sorting the city. And that is the series of processes that have separated us spatially by race, by class, by lifestyle, by sexual orientation, by religion, by age. Tom Hanchett, in his book, Sorting Out the New South City, notice I didn't press the wrong button, I'm learning, made a startling observation. In 1875, the city of Charlotte was not segregated. Black people and white people, rich and poor, were mixed together, and to this day you can see big mansions next door to shotgun houses. By 1925, the city had become more divided, but in a pattern that he called patchwork. But by 1975, the city had become intensely divided in a pattern that he called sectoral. And this is the map from 1875, and you can see all of those dots are people sprinkled in together. This is as it begins to sort out, 1925. And this is a map from the 1990 census, and you can see how concentrated people are, no longer dispersed. He concluded, having so carefully observed the intensity of this process, that segregation begets segregation, that sorting is not something we did in the past that sits statically in our society, but that it's an active, destructive process, destroying all of us because it's constantly tearing apart our society. And it is this tearing apart that was the way I connected with Pittsburgh. In 1996, I had written a paper called Psychiatric Implications of Displacement, which was published in the American Journal of Psychiatry. And Dean Don Madison invited me to come to speak at the Graduate School of Public Health. And it was there, as Ken Doino mentioned, that people from the Hill came up to me and said, we know what you're talking about. We know this pain of displacement. Please come to the Hill because we are facing new displacement in the Hope 6 projects. Phil Hallen, who was then president of the Maurice Falk Medical Fund, actually funded a fellowship so that I was able to come to Pittsburgh 3 days a week over an 18-month period and get to know the Hill. But my first visit was in this leaflet, hey, do you know you're moving? How do you feel about it? Come out and talk. And I got to go to the housing projects, to Bedford Dwellings and Aliquippa Terrace, and talk to people who were facing impending demolition of their communities. This was top-down decision-making. Nobody had been asked. It was terrifying, and it stirred up horrific feelings of the urban renewal that had happened in the past. Nothing could be more different than the few months that have preceded this talk, and which led me to conclude that there's been some kind of fundamental shift in your city. And I'd like to say that on February 17th, as it turns out, 1997, was the day I gave the talk at the Graduate School of Public Health on displacement when I was approached by leaders of the Hill to go to the Hill. And it turns out that on February 17th, 2012, exactly 15 years later, I was invited by Ken Doino to go to Homewood. And sitting in Operation Better Block with many leaders of the Homewood community, with people from the URA, the Urban Redevelopment Association, with funders, with community residents, with people from every sector of the neighborhood, I was stunned by the shift. This was completely different from the terror on the faces of the people in Aliquippa Terrace and Bedford Dwellings, who had no understanding of why they should be doomed to lose their communities. This was a true conversation among equals about the future of the Homewood neighborhood. Many, many, many people have contributed to these 15 years, and so this is, I'm just gonna name one of the thousands, but shout out and props to all of you. And this is a photo of Terry Baltimore. We were walking around in the Hill one day, surveying people. It's this constant effort, talking to people, trying to articulate a different vision of the city and of how the city should work, of being present for each other, that I believe has led to this shift. I am finishing a book, as Ken mentioned, Urban Alchemy. Want to underscore that in your minds. But when you're writing a book, you have to collect a lot of facts. And I had pretty much collected all the facts for my book. But there's another task in writing a book, and that is that you have to get to the soul of the book. You have to find out kind of where its heart lives. And I had not succeeded in doing that as of that day in Homewood, February 17th, 2012. And so therefore you might say that I was on a quest. And so I want to tell you 4 stories of my quest and what took me to the soul of this book, to the heart of it, and to the heart of this story about Pittsburgh. And I'd like to, so actually, you know, this is kind of a vision quest, but actually sort of people set me chores. So the first story that I want to tell you is called What Selma Brody Told Me. And I first want to introduce you to Selma Brody. Can we do something about the sound? No, it's not coming out here. No? All right. I'll have to introduce you to Selma Brody another way. No. We'll just keep going. But maybe if somebody could work on the sound, because the second video is really essential. Do we have somebody we can send? Selma Brody and Jules Brody are 2 South African activists who have been in the struggle against apartheid their whole lives. Jules Brody was a classmate with Nelson Mandela, and Selma Brody was part of many, many movements to defeat apartheid. She's a physician and an activist and was actually elected on a progressive ticket, and so became one of the representatives and one of the spokespeople because the black people in South Africa were completely excluded from government. She became their spokesperson and led many of the fights, and led a very important fight against displacement. Hey. Shall we go back and meet Selma Brody in person? All right. Oh. I'll keep telling you about Selma Brody while this video plays. One of the things was that in Soweto, there was no electricity whatsoever. So imagine being in a dense urban neighborhood, not a single light. People were terrified to go out after dark. It was very dangerous. And they were begging people, please put in some lights. And Selma Brody led the struggle to put in high mast lighting, very tall lights that put the first electricity down on the field in Soweto. My friend Paul Brody sent me this video of his parents because they were being given an award, and I fell in love with them and wrote back to him, I would love to meet your parents. And he said, well, they're coming to New York, and maybe you can meet them then. In the meantime, as part of my vision quest, so the first task I was set, and these tasks arrive very randomly by different people. The first task I was set was somebody called me up and said, by any chance, do you have the urban renewal map of Pittsburgh? Not the urban renewal map, the redlining map. So I give many speeches in which I talk about Pittsburgh, and I have a whole series of maps about Pittsburgh. And when I get to the redlining map, I show this map, which you'll notice is Syracuse. Did anybody notice that? This has been a sore point with me, but frankly, just between you and me, I was really nervous about going to the National Archives. But when I was confronted, do you have a copy of the Pittsburgh? Nobody had ever asked me. Nobody had ever commented. Maybe they thought that was Pittsburgh. Anyway, I'd gotten away with it for years. I was really embarrassed, and I thought I have to confront my fears. So I asked some of my students if they would go with me, and we had a road trip to the National Archives. When you go to the National Archives, and I actually highly recommend it, the first thing you have to do is get ID. This ID is really important. It's the coin of the realm. It's an ID with your picture and a magnetic strip. You have to show it to people all the time to get in and out so they know you're not stealing. And you use it to swipe so that you can make copies, so that you can scan. Very, very important thing. And so we had been told by Richard Marciano on the faculty at UNC Chapel Hill the exact box to get for the redlining map of Pittsburgh. We sent for the box. It arrived. We pulled out a folder. Actually, we pulled out more than one folder, and somebody came over and yelled at us, you can only have one folder on the desk at a time. They actually came over quite a few times to tell us we'd done something bad. And then we saw this. And we all said, wow, it's so beautiful. But, and this is an exploration of the meaning of things. Beauty is only skin deep. What is the meaning of this thing? And this thing is in your program. And you can also read along on the rating sheets that I'm going to tell you about in your program. There are 4 colors on this map: green, blue, yellow, and red. These colors relate to an assessment of the presence or absence of old buildings and non-white people. And this map is an explicit expression of an economic linkage between American segregation and space, how space will be funded. Green areas were green for mortgages. They could get mortgage money, they could get home repair money, they could get homeowners insurance. Red areas were red. Stop, don't invest here. And so we read many of the actual rating sheets, and for Pittsburgh, they had actually the handwritten sheets and the typed up sheets. So we read many of these. And this is what we encountered. So you can see this in your book perhaps a little better than you can on the screen, so I invite you to look there. You'll notice that about East Liberty, which they gave a security grade of D, they said it's got good transportation, near employment, but detrimental influences obsolescence, poor conditions of structure, lower class populace. Perhaps some of you might have been part of that lower class populace that was bringing East Liberty down. The inhabitants were laborers, they were poor. Among the foreign-born, which is an important category, there were Greek and Italian, there were Negroes, and there was an infiltration of Italian and Negro. Notice that Negro is not capitalized. This is an important issue because Negro is the proper name of a race and should always be capitalized. And African Americans, and certainly the NAACP, fought that battle constantly. Pittsburgh on the north side, given a D rating also, low-lying territory, favorable influences, none. Detrimental influences, dirt, filth, smoke, etc. Low-type community, one of the toughest sections of Pittsburgh. Type, very mixed, foreign-born, mixed. Infiltration of everything. Pittsburgh on the north side, fairly level, favorable influences, good transportation, shopping center within walking distance to downtown, near employment of diversified character, detrimental influences, old district, no room for residential expansion, future commercial, type, mixed, foreign-born, German, Bohemian, Negro, yes, infiltration of foreign. The Hill District, hilly. They sent some geniuses out on this project. Another brilliant observation, near the center of town. Concentration of Negro and undesirables. Very congested. Type, labor, foreign-born, mixture, infiltration of Negro. So my dad, I mentioned, moved north in the Great Migration, and this is a photo of my dad shortly after he got to Jersey City. One of those Negroes. And this is my granddaughter, Lily, at her bat mitzvah last December 31st. And the prayer shawl that she's being draped with was brought over by our family on one of the last boats out of Europe before the Nazis took over. As I sat there with those folders, it was these images that were in my head and in my heart. And a certain kind of screaming started in my head because I couldn't say anything that would make those rating sheets and those maps. We happened to look at dozens of maps that day, hundreds of rating sheets. There was nothing I could say that could protect my family from those rating sheets, that could protect my country from the racism that I was reading about. It happened that I was having lunch with Selma Brody 2 days later. And she sat down in the restaurant and adjusted her hearing aid and leaned forward and said, I don't remember perfectly what it is you do, though I've been looking forward to meeting you. And I said, well, I'm a psychiatrist and I study cities. And she said, tell me more. And within seconds, those of you who know me know I always have a notebook. I had pulled out my notebook and I had said, well, I just went to the National Archives and I got the redlining map. And look at what they said. And I ranted. And after a few minutes, she leaned forward and she said, it's very anger-provoking, isn't it? And then I laughed, and then I said, and tell me about what you do. And she told me about her work in AIDS and all the communities that are so severely affected in South Africa. Brilliant, amazing work. And then she started to rant about how the bureaucrats wouldn't give her any money. And her son, Paul, my friend, leaned forward and said, it's very anger-provoking, isn't it? It would be bad if they just said those bad things. But words have power. And saying there were undesirable racial elements living in East Liberty and in the Hill and on the North Side led directly to action. And what was that action? East Liberty urban renewal, North Side urban renewal, the Hill. These are not ways in which you make a city better. I am very proud of my certificate in landscape design. And I promise you, if you want to nurture something, you don't bulldoze it. So I want to tell you the second story, which is called The Corner That Went Vertical. I actually heard an architect say that a building should have gone vertical. I'm a psychiatrist. When do I get to say something as cute as it should have gone vertical? Imagine a patient lying on a couch and you say, "You may go vertical now." So I had to use it. I had to, you know. You know when you hear an expression and you have to use it? So anyway. I was invited to the Center of Architecture in the fall to be part of a panel on public spaces for dissent. And this was after Occupy Wall Street. So it was architects, planners, urbanists, talking about where does our society provide where we can say that whatever is on our minds. This is the Hill before urban renewal. And it's just dense and full. And you could not automatically put a billboard in the middle of that. This is the plan for urban renewal, and it'll be very familiar to most of you. The strips are the roads they're going to put in, and the circle thing is the civic arena. After taking the first section of urban renewal, it was announced that they were going to take a second section of urban renewal from Crawford Street to Kirkpatrick. Imagine that, all of you who know the Hill. And so the community organized to put up this billboard. Crawford and Center, where this billboard was erected, was in the middle of that dense, dense, dense neighborhood where you would never put a billboard. But you could put a billboard there now because they'd cleared such a vast area of land and it was visible from a very, very long distance. That was a powerful billboard because it succeeded. It stopped. There was no urban renewal past that point. That corner went vertical. That corner also became a site for gathering, for starting civil rights and human rights marches. When Occupy Pittsburgh on October 15th decided to go down to Mellon Square and begin to occupy Pittsburgh, they started at Freedom Corner. Salah Uddin told me that Miss Thelma Lovett has a bus ticket in her possession for the March on Washington in 1963, and they say the buses will meet at Freedom Corner. So from when this billboard went up in 1960 to then, 3 years later, it had already become known. You didn't have to say the address. Just say, meet me at Freedom Corner. That's where the march will start, and people knew. And this corner has become and has stayed so important to the civic life of Pittsburgh that in 2001, a memorial was erected there. And this memorial has several circles of honoring people, honoring those lost to the struggle and honoring people who were still living. And one of the people they honored was Phil Hallen. So Phil Hallen, who was, I mentioned, the president of the Maurice Falk Medical Fund, is somebody who's been in the Hill and been present, and he knew that he should fund my visits to Pittsburgh, not because I wrote a fancy proposal and justified it, but because he was always in the Hill and people told him this would be a good thing to do, and because he knew how to listen. And he lived his life in solidarity with that community. Well, Phil also likes to drive around Pittsburgh in a convertible, and he likes to help people fall in love with Pittsburgh. And this is my beautiful granddaughter Lily before she chopped her hair off. And at the end of this ride around Pittsburgh, she said, "Okay, Grandma, we can't move, but we could move to Pittsburgh." Pittsburgh has demolished the civic arena. What next? The reimagining of this space is important. And part of what is really before us, and what I'm talking about today, is reimagining together. What would we like to see as a result of some conversation? I have heard a proposed park at the tip where the historic Hill met downtown 50 years ago. But I've also heard a proposal to put a community reconciliation park along Crawford, which has been the edge of the city the edge of the neighborhood for 50 years. What would we gain from being at the point downtown? One of the things is that I think that where we stand makes a difference. I am standing facing you. But I also have my back to those curtains. They're not going to take any offense. But if I am standing on the point looking at downtown, I have my back to the hill. Is that how I want to be positioned? If I'm standing on Crawford Street, can I be a link? Can I have my arms stretched out in both directions? It is in these conversations that we together find the future, a good future. We are in the August Wilson Center, and there are two things that I have to say about August Wilson. The first is, I love the idea of an August Park. August Wilson wrote a play for every decade of the Hill, the 20th century cycle of plays. And perhaps we might, in this Reconciliation Park, place one statue every year for 10 years to celebrate the cycle of plays. And the second thing I want to say is that August Wilson's last play, Radio Golf, is about 1997. A developer is celebrating a plan to destroy Aunt Esther's house. And he's going to get rich, and he's going to have a fabulous time. And then there's a knock on the door, and a guy walks in, Elder Barlow. And he says, I'm looking for some Christians. Do you know any Christians? Do you like to find some Christian people? And Harmon Wilkes is like, go down to the Salvation Army, get out of here. And of course, Elder Barlow sits down and starts a conversation. And one thing leads to another. And Harmon Wilkes pivots. He changes. He shifts. I saw that play, and I was with my cousin, Linny Golightly, and I said, I was there. I was there in 1997 when they pivoted. I don't know how it happened, and I don't know what went on in your hearts, but I believe that August Wilson understood some deep zeitgeist of this city in saying that it happened then and in putting it in his last play. I did that thing again. The third story is Flower Communion. Some people don't know it, but actually everybody who knows me well does know it, that I'm arrogant and bossy, and I'm always right. And so I said to a friend from another city, I'm a Unitarian Universalist, and as is this friend, and I said, Flower Communion, which we celebrate in June, was invented at my church, and my friend said, did you ever read Wikipedia? So it's like, it was said much more politely than that, but I was like, ah. So I did what you would do. I checked. I said, he's wrong, right? I'm right. Tell me the truth, I said to my minister. The minister said, well, actually, Flower Communion was started in Czechoslovakia, but here's the story. Norbert Kapek was a Baptist minister in Czechoslovakia who came to the United States. And he wanted to become a Unitarian minister, but he was having trouble getting credentialed. In the meantime, he joined First Unitarian Church, my church. He signed the membership book that I've signed in 1921. And our minister helped him get credentialed. He then went back to Czechoslovakia and founded the Unitarian Church there, which became the largest Unitarian church in the world. This might not be in Wikipedia, but that's what my minister said, so anyway. In founding this church, he wanted to create rituals that would support the kind of free thinking that we Unitarian Universalists are famous for. And so he invented Flower Communion, a service in which everyone brings a flower and places it in a common basket or vase, and then at the end of the service, everyone takes a flower, not one they brought, but another flower, without regard for its beauty or its size, but really in the sense that we are all brothers and sisters, and the flowers represent all of us. It's a very beautiful service. This was startling to me, but it made me feel very joyous. in many ways, a complex story. Norbert Kepak was killed by the Nazis, and his wife then came to live in the United States, and she too became a Unitarian minister. I loved the feeling that my church was part of the lives of these two amazing people. And I loved the feeling that in celebrating Flower Communion, I was part of that. This is a point that Michel Cantal-Dupart, the French urbanist with whom I've studied, often makes to me, that we're part of the world. And here he is at the New Granada. When he first came in 1998, one of the ideas for how do you reanimate the hill was fix up the New Granada. And he has said that that's important, but that will not save the hill. He said the problem with the hill is that it has been systematically disconnected from the rest of the city. The roads have been cut, the incline is taken down, the buses don't run. You must reconnect the hill to the system of the city. You must reconnect it to the economy. You must reconnect it to the social flow. You must reconnect it physically for it to be part of, for it to thrive. Everybody looked at him very blankly, as this was not a popular idea in Pittsburgh at that time. You want us to connect to other neighborhoods? This will not happen in Pittsburgh. And so he went home and he actually had a sleepless night. We happened to be staying at the Pittsburgh Athletic Club, and he had a sleepless night trying to think how he could say this to us. And the question he posed was, how did people get to work? How did your grandfathers and fathers get to work? The mills were down by the rivers. How did they get there? And people said, oh, they took the incline. Oh, they took the stairs. Oh, they walked down different streets. Oh, but that street doesn't exist anymore. The incline is gone. The stairs are in ruins. And Cantal said to us, you must find the way to the rivers. And you must recreate those connections to the rivers. And that will save the hill. I was visiting with him 2 weeks ago as finishing my book, fact-checking and going back to visit projects that I've seen over these years. And he has a house in a village, a very small village called Sognac, which is south of Bordeaux on the Atlantic coast. And he was explaining to me how he reanimated the village by setting up a series of posters about the village history. You could walk into an empty village and say, oh, this is an empty village. But if you see a poster and you read it, you realize this is a place of history and culture and interest. And one of the posters is about the river that runs through there, which connects the village to the ocean. And he said, think of it. We're in the middle of a pine forest. And indeed we were. There's pines on every side. He said, but this isn't a village in the woods. This is a village in the woods in the world. When we did a film festival, we showed Gone with the Wind. Well, why do you think we showed Gone with the Wind? I was completely puzzled. He said, because when Sherman marched through Georgia, he burned the pine forests. And it was those pine forests that were supplying the British Navy. When the British Navy couldn't get pine products from Georgia, they came to this pine forest here where I live. And we became rich and wealthy. And these huge houses, my huge pharmacy, was built with that money. They thought it would last forever. It didn't. But that's how we are a village in the woods, in the world. And so here we are. Michelle and Cyrus were giving out flowers on Flower Communion at my small church. A small church in a small African-American city in the world. The last quest was given to me by my mother, and it had to do with, in her last days, she was in a nursing home, which she had decorated with her wonderful, wonderful art collection. And so she said to me, there were one particular set of 4 pictures, and she said, I want you to take those, arranged just like that, and I want you to put it in your house, and I want you to call that Maggie's Corner. And in fact, the photo that's on your program, the poster, is a photo of me standing in Maggie's Corner. The thing I want you to see is this thing, which is a needlepoint, and you can see the edge of it in the poster. This was a picture in a magazine, and my mother loved it because the different colors of hands and that were linked together really inspired her. To her, this was the world that she wanted to see. And she called this the fourth world. When Pittsburgh decided about urban renewal, it was these men, Mellon Bank and all these banks, who got together and said, all these poor neighborhoods filled with foreign-born and Negroes and infiltration of everything and Jewish, these are the men who said those neighborhoods should be destroyed. They didn't ask the people in those neighborhoods. They didn't involve them in the conversation. It was a unilateral, top-down decision of one small segment, a very rich and powerful segment, but one small segment of the population. There was a dinner last night for many of the partners who funded this lecture, and I asked them if they would be so kind as to pose for a photo. And these are the people who funded and who helped to bring people here today. And you can see that they're all ages, and they're all colors, and they're women. This is, if a picture is worth 1,000 words, it is the difference between these two photographs that I'm trying to suggest is the difference that I've seen in Pittsburgh. My mother, in 1957, discovered a map that displayed how the city where we lived, Orange, New Jersey, had gerrymandered the schools. And she took this map to my father, who was an organizer, and she said, you must get rid of this illegal segregation of our schools. So that's what my mother did when she got a map. I said, you know, when Steve said, would I give this lecture, I said yes, and I would be most grateful if you would give everyone a copy of the redlining map so that they could take it with them and show it to someone, preferably some really good community organizer, someone who can look at the rating sheets and look at that map and help us convene the conversations that we need to get this hatred out of our space. When I was running last year, I gotta go mechanically because perhaps I can't. All right, I'm just gonna tell you a story by Nelson Mandela. Then we'll go to my mother. That's my mother. Paul Brody, so my buddy, whose parents, when he sent me the video, I was looking at the video and I was anticipating a story about Nelson Mandela and his dad, Paul's dad. And the video, that story wasn't in the videos that you didn't get to see, but anyway, the story's not in there anyway. This is a really good story. So I said, so, you know, here's what I think the story was about. He said, you know, you didn't really get it quite right, but here's the story. Nelson Mandela and my dad were organizing a dinner for some lawyers, and Nelson Mandela wanted to be sure that a certain man was invited. And my dad said, why do you care so much about him? And Paul explained to me, he said, Madiba. Now, that was not a term I was familiar with, so I looked it up. And it's the name of Nelson Mandela's tribe. And they said that when somebody is really honored, they give them the name of their tribe. So Paul said, Madiba took my father's hands in his, and he looked my father in the eye, and he said, I want that man to come because he wouldn't sit next to me when we were young lawyers. And I want to say to him, you wouldn't sit next to me. You may not remember it, but I do. But what I want you to know is that I forgive you. South Africa did a very public truth and reconciliation process. I have never heard that Pittsburgh did such a thing. But I do believe that people know this history, this horrible history of redlining, this horrible history of urban renewal, this horrible history of marginalization, this horrible history of racism. and that people have had quiet moments, perhaps with a few friends or perhaps by themselves, in which they have acknowledged this truth, and in which they have said to themselves and to each other, I don't want to be in that city. This pivot that August Wilson wrote about, Harmon Wilkes changing, is something that I believe each of you might stand up and tell us about if we had the time. It is this personal and private, which seems so very suitable to Pittsburgh, doesn't it? Very proper city, very dignified. But yet that people would take a quiet time, perhaps in an evening, perhaps in a park, and say, I want a better future for all of us. I want to give the last word to my mother, who died on February 18th. And as I think I'm going to cry, let me thank you in advance for your attention.
It's from 1 to 91, and it's simply my memoirs. Well, we have to sell a book. I only died in class and you were $10,000 sooner, and so that you can publish 10 more books. We have one. I have one grant for 1,000, which has been turned in. So we've only got 9 to go. Yes, there's nothing about my life that I kept back. I was hesitant. Originally, I said, no, I'm not going to show it to the family. Because there are some shocking things in it. I mean, there's some shocking things in it. I was only a child in the lower grades when I learned that white people who don't like to see other white people being friends with black people. That's almost before I could read. I was told what Dr. W.E.B. Du Bois called the problem of the 20th century, the color problem. This person was brought home to me again when I was in college. This time I was old enough to begin to understand it, believe it was wrong, and wish I could do something about it. When I finished college, I went south to learn. At the end of my life, I'm grateful that early on I came face to face with the big issue of my time, one that still faces our country and the world, even now in the 21st century. Not to be part of that story is to miss life's greatest challenge. Seek it out and do your best. Langston Hughes, in a few words, brilliantly summarized my credo. Not me alone, but the whole oppressed must put their hands with mine to shake the pillars of those temples wherein the rule breathes upheld. That must be ended. I underestimated my own especially, and I certainly misestimated my father. I didn't know he was so bigoted. He kept my family from ever meeting my children. Well, that's in the book. You should read my book. The world moved on very rapidly in the 20th century and the beginning of the 21st, so that just keeping up with current events was something you had to do almost daily as you went along. Something new would happen. There'd be an earthquake or a revolution. It was as simple as that. Realizing that everything that was happening was impacting my life. So it makes a difference if you just open your eyes. We must get out of our living rooms. We must live out where the people are living and embrace those issues and try to push them forward. Otherwise, what good is it to live in your living room and watch TV? It has been a rejuvenation and a reincarnation, a rescue of my life, the writing of the book, because it frees one from any guilt feelings and resentment against the hard work you had to do and the deprivations along the way, so that the days that are left are free and joyous. And I covet this for all the people who are in any elderly or poor situation, if they start writing, they will work their way out of that and feel free. I really recommend it. I am Maggie Colin, I-N-K instead of I-N-C, Inc. So I have a blog, I have an email, I have, you name it, I got it. I may not be able to find it, but I got it. I need to raise these grants, and we have, Cheryl and I have some plans for how she's going to do that. Seriously, we're going to have a campaign which we get some of this other material out of the way. We'll tackle seriously. Seriously.
Ken and Steve said they would come back up and join me and we could have questions and answers. And I think there's some mics that can move around the room. So I'd love to hear your thoughts.
So, Thor or others, do we have somebody who has some microphones? But if people have questions or would like to have share stories or observations, our goal tonight is to follow up on Mindy's incredible sharing here and have some other thoughts shared back and forth. So these don't have to necessarily be questions as much as a dialogue. And I believe we have a microphone and somebody carrying those microphones, but I don't see that. So I'm kind of curious about that at this particular point.
But if not, just stand up and speak.
Just stand up and we will repeat, too. If need
Yes, please.
Yeah, sounds like you've done some work in France, or at least know a little bit about what's going on there. And I'm a little bit curious because it seems like some of the cities within France have been sorted out where some of the poor populations have been pushed to the outskirts. And I'm wondering if there's any way we sort of push towards urbanism here to avoid that same, I guess, effect.
The stories of France and the United States are very different, so it's not the same at all. And what's important about France, and the reason it's been so fascinating to go there, and certainly the work of Michel Cantal-Dupart, is the enormous effort that many French cities are putting into undoing, which is kind of an artifact of history, which is that many people who were from former colonies moved into the cities right after World War II. And so when they made new construction, they made it at the edges of cities. So the stories are not at all the same, and the politics in France against disconnection are very powerful. So I think we have much to learn from them. And sadly, some in France would like to follow our example, so it's like, no, don't do that. Aha, the microphone.
Oh, the microphones have appeared.
Thank you so much.
So I'm curious if you're aware, since you brought South Africa and Pittsburgh together, okay, of District 6 in Cape Town.
I am aware of District 6 in Cape Town.
Okay, and one of the things that links your talk in District 6 is, of course, the leveling of District 6, a decision made by white apartheid governments in Cape Town. But then what came out of it, and something you hinted at, but you could pull it off better than me, okay, is the use of memory to reconstruct mentally the place. The land is still not developed. It was destroyed in '64, and nothing has been built on it except the college that wrote the book about District 6. you know, the hill is a wonderful, the destruction of the lower hill is a wonderful way to use that same sense of memory. What began as a 2-week exhibition is now a 15-year-old museum where everybody brought to the museum all the things they stole when they were bulldozed out of their houses. So this is an area, you talked about people sitting in parks and having conversations, but the conversation has to go broader than that. Hence the decision where to build a memory park has to come after the creations of memories, and they're plural. So, but you can do that. Phil Halen will help you, and you can get the good funding, and you can find a place to do it, and let me know when it opens.
I'm going to put you on the advisory committee.
I am not involved in development, but I was very struck by Pittsburgh's 21st century triumph. My experience is some small triumphs, a meeting in Homewood, for example, that you give a shot for, but that we have to be ever vigilant. I mean, any conversation, for example, now that the Civic Arena is down, it doesn't feel to me like we're clear about what will happen with that land now. My response is always, we should get together the families that were displaced and let them decide what should happen to it. I am not so positive as it feels like this title seems. And I'm just so curious in really hearing more about how you can use the word triumph. And I don't know.
I think that's a great question. And the answer is that a city is never something that you make. Democracy is never something that you make. It's never finished. It's not a product. It's a process. And so the triumph is the emergence of the process. And I think that's an absolute triumph. And that's all we will ever have is a process of respect, a process of dignity. When we get together and talk, we're going to make some good decisions. We're going to make some bad decisions. But if we are talking to each other, we have the greatest possible chance of solving the enormous problems that we face in our society. None of us knows what to do about global warming and the melting of the polar ice caps. None of us knows how to get out of the foreclosure crisis. None of us knows how to get out of this recession. But together, we do know. And that conversation, therefore, is the triumph. And yes, it is hard. And that's why my mother said that, just that my mother was in terrible despair about her life because it was so hard. There was so much deprivation. Imagine being a white woman. One of the shocking facts in the book is that I was born out of wedlock. Imagine doing that in 1950 in New Jersey. Having a black baby out of wedlock. It was really hard. She was totally ashamed of her life because she thought she had not succeeded, because she thought success was a product. When she wrote the book, I think the thing she took away from it, and what gave her joy, was the John Wesley quote, "Do all the good you can." And she came to see her life as a process in which every day she got up and tried to do all the good she could. And she tried to be welcoming and kind. She never, ever, ever turned her back on someone who wanted to be her friend. That's the triumph. It's hard to see because we're living in so much pain. It's so discouraging. We're so full of resentment. But that's the triumph.
My name is Randall Taylor. I served for 12 years representing Homewood on the Pittsburgh Board of Education. And I just wanted to respectfully raise a few concerns with some things you had said about Homewood, that there was a representative group of people that you have talked with. You mentioned Operation Better Block, which was an organization that struggled for years for funding. And then suddenly, about a year and a half ago, they have a lot of money, they now have a lot of staff, and no one knows why or who that they're funding. And so with a few people who are trying to make a stand in Homewood, and I think the reason why you maybe didn't see a lot of people raising concerns is, you know, what happened on the Hill, what happened in East Liberty, what's happening in Garfield. People are just now, hey, you know, it's our turn now. But there are a few of us who are coming together. And one thing I want to send you is a nice tape that we had on RCT radio with somebody hosting a show, and there's about six of us talking about development in Homewood. I think you'd be interested in that. But I just wanted to just say that there are some of us who want to fight for a neighborhood that's integrated economically, just the way it used to be on the Hill, where poor kids could live next to someone who's a doctor and a lawyer. And as we've seen so far from what has happened, that has not been the case, what's happened on the Hill and others. We want to talk about different ways that people can get home ownership. We want to talk about single rooms where people can live on minimum wage and just have a single room that they sleep in, that they can build from. So we want to talk about some different alternatives. And I'm just saying to folks who are here from the URA and others, there are people who are going to make a stand in Homewood, that the people who have lived there for decades and have lived through the ugly things now, if there's going to be any development in Homewood, they have a right to live there and to stay there and to live in the city and the community they grew up in that they love.
I couldn't agree more heartily that the people who are in Homewood, people who are in the Hill, the people who are in East Liberty have a right to stay there. These are debates that are unresolved, and they will never be resolved. But it is not the same. It is not the same as a room full of white men of great wealth saying that our neighborhoods would be bulldozed without any conversation whatsoever. Maybe we need to make a bigger table. Maybe we need to invite more people to it. I'm sure we do. But there is a table now that did not exist before. And we have to all show up and fight for exactly what you said. So thank you so much for, I don't mean to say it's easy or that it has succeeded. And you're exactly right that that's the fight that lies ahead.
Mindy, welcome back.
George. Good to be here.
First of all, thanks for everybody, for the sponsors having you here. I think it's very good. But I'd like to go to something to piggyback on what Randall said and some other things that you just said. I think we're in a different mode now. There's a big conference going on in Pittsburgh right now. And many of us who need to be at that table are not at that table. And those folks are the decision makers, the planners, the folks that want to see change, but the people who will be affected by that change are not invited to the table. I often, and I learned from you very well, that people now that we are being asked to come to the table, but people are not listening to what we are saying. In other words, we have a seat, but our concerns are still not being addressed or adhered to. So I think when you came in 1997 to the Hill, to Addison and Bedford, we weren't at the table. Now we are being asked to come to the table, but our concerns are not being addressed. I mean, we see it every day that the city and others do things, and we are still not at the table. I think a great thing is happening in the Larimer area, where they are trying to bring a broad consensus to the table, building off what happened in the Hill, and now transferring it even bigger to the Lorimer district, which is much needed. But as one who grew up in the Hill, loves the Hill, got displaced and beat up from East Liberty, but as you had me to look in root shock, every place that I lived in my life is gone, as I knew it as a kid. My house on South Side, my house on the Lower Hill, the public housing communities of Bedford, where my son was born on Francis Street, where I lived in East Liberty in those high rises, gone. And people still do not listen to the people who were being affected by these change. And I think that is what Pittsburgh, as we move forward, has to do a better job of, listening to the people, listening to what they are saying. As an organizer, I go out all the time, and I think I know what people know, what they need, until I get to the meeting. And then the people tell me what they need. And as I have to listen, I think the power to be has to also listen. So I would encourage the folks that are at that conference, big time that's going on now, that they listen to some of the folks in this room instead of having or recreating that board of those 25, 26 white males all over again. So it's imperative that the politics of all this have to be stripped and started all over again for what you were saying to happen throughout the city of Pittsburgh, for those that have been disinvested in so long to be a part of the solution.
Thank you so much, George. That was brilliantly said.
Hi, I have a question that I'm not sure I can form it completely clearly, but I'll try. I work in East Liberty at a theater that's been there for almost 100 years. And it's interesting what's happening now. When I started 4 years ago, there were lots of people who'd lost their connection to the theater, or maybe never had one to begin with, and didn't see it as particularly important. And then there were other people who were still very connected to it and saw it as very important. Most of the people who saw it as very important were Black. And most of the people who didn't see it as important, or maybe it was once important but no longer, were white. Now, I think 4 years later, that's shifted, and it's a little bit more even. There are still people who don't think it's very important, and we say, well, shame on you. And then the group of people who think it's important is more mixed. However, recently, there was a celebration, a groundbreaking for the Highland building, which is a building that lots of developers had tried and failed many times to develop, and ELDI and other people had tried. In any case, long story short, it's now, there was a groundbreaking and people are celebrating the future. And the people on stage, and I have a photo actually on my phone of the people with the shovels when they were taking the picture and the hard hats. And it didn't look too different from that photo that you showed with the white men. And I was standing there, and of course, I'm excited. My theater is just stone's throw away, and people are going to be living and looking right down on it, and presumably they'll think it's important and valuable, and it'll be good for the theater, and it'll be good for the neighborhood to have a viable theater. So I'm excited about that, but I'm conflicted because I'm not sure what's really happening. And I'm not sure what's the meaning of everything that's really happening. And there are words that are being used like, resurrection, revitalization, new beginning. Several times, in several ways, it was said this was, a neighborhood that didn't have anything and was now experiencing a resurgence. So the result of this, nothing to something. And I know that there was something. There wasn't nothing. So I guess I'm wondering, to get to my question, maybe two questions.
It was the greatest speech. I'm fascinated.
Two questions.
Yes.
One is the meaning of racism in these conversations. Has that changed from your perspective or understanding? I'm not sure that we all know or even mean the same thing when we say racism anymore. So that's one question. And then the second question is related to this quote that you have projected about keys being passed from generation to generation. And it seems to me that one of the ways that that happens is by the institutions that remain in the neighborhoods. And I'm wondering if you agree with that idea.
I'll take the second question first. Yes. In America, we're passing two keys. Our nation was founded on the twin gods of freedom and slavery. We have never got past that contradiction. Right? Compromise at the Constitutional Convention that to get the slave-owning states into the new nation, we accepted that they could be slave states. How does that jibe with liberty and justice for all? What does that have to do with the rights of man? We've never got past that. That's the tug of war that we're all talking about. So how do you have a triumph in such a tug of war? You have a triumph in such a tug of war, not because you knock over the other side, but because we're going to shift the rules of the game. We're going to have a game in which, as George says, we're all at the table and we insist on listening. We're going to have, as the gentleman from Homewood said, a game in which we get a lot of different people to the table, a really big table. At the end of the Vietnam War, there was a huge discussion before they could sign the peace, before they could have the peace negotiations, about the shape of the table. What was the shape of the table going to be? And everybody who's tried to promote a collective conversation knows that you have to figure out the shape of the table. How are you going to sit with each other? So yeah, we have to debate the shape of the table. They ended up with a 5-sided table, and we ended the war. Has the nature of racism changed? I'd like to go back to Tom Hanchett and the sorting out of the city. The fundamental process in America coming from this duality of freedom and slavery is, I believe, as Jane Jacobs and Tom Hanchett have identified, this sorting process. It is a vile, ongoing, active process. We have not stopped the process of sorting out the city. That is why people are threatened with displacement from Homewood. That is why they're threatened with displacement in the Hill. That is why gentrification is hovering over East Liberty. Sorting has not been stopped. How can we stop sorting? I have no idea. But I would be glad to sit at any table we think will work with all of you to figure that out. We are never going to figure it out, just me sitting by myself in my office. We can only figure it out collectively. And therefore, the triumph is the conversation. If everyone leaves here with a copy of the program and sits down with one friend and said, let's study this redlining map. Let's have a book group about the redlining map. Let's read some rating sheets. There are plenty of redlining maps online these days, and you can look at the rating sheets. Let's understand the language of racism that has shaped the modern American city. Let's understand the enemy. The redlining map is the enemy. We have not defeated that enemy. Take the map and talk to somebody about it. Let's see what happens. It will change. Elder Joe Barlow walked into Harmon Wilkes' office and said, I'm looking for some Christians. Do you know some Christians? And Harmon Wilkes changes his position. It is that that's so ripping about Pittsburgh. And no question, I'm sure white people get together a lot. They don't invite me, so I wouldn't know.
Some of us do.
I said they. Steve insisted that he invites me. He does. My mother invited me too.
Making the conversation of what goes on with gentrification or the various things that are happening to neighborhoods and not making it about the inequality that has been built into the system over the last 32 or 3 years, it doesn't matter what the table looks like or who's there, as long as we're continuing a system propagated by the best government money can buy. Is there any way around that?
The best government money can buy or inequality?
I think they're the same thing.
Oh, okay. The constant displacement of populations is a potent force in creating inequality in our society. And it's working in a variety of ways. It's working because we create the sorted out city, we divide people, because separate is inherently unequal. We use those divisions to then distribute resources. If you go now to, in the whole state of Pennsylvania, there are very few green areas, very few green neighborhoods. I don't know why it's reverberating. There are very few green areas. But where there are green areas, there are shade trees, beautiful old shade trees. Go to a red area, something that was labeled red in 1937, you won't see beautiful old shade trees as one resource that was distributed via that system. If we just maldistribute resources so that there's a huge concentration of resources at the top and very little at the bottom, we have also determined the pace and the structure and the vulnerability of our society to 3 problems. The first is to disease. The second is to paralysis. If we are divided, we can't talk to each other, which is, of course, the issue that I'm stressing here. But the third is that if we are divided, we cannot control the rule of greed. My mother said, put your hand in mine, and let us shake those pillars wherein greed is upheld. But to do that, we have to be together. So I do believe in change, and I do believe in fairies and Tinkerbell. I do believe in these things. And I believe that it's my mother's triumph at the end of her life, which was just an extraordinary thing for us to see. A woman who thought her life had been a failure, who wrote a book about her struggles, who came to understand that every day of her life she got up and she went to the struggle. She didn't sit in her living room. She got up and she went to see how she could make the world better. Maybe it was a simple thing. The nurses who would come into her room had terrible working conditions. And when I would arrive, she would say, you're not going to believe how they're treating these people. Mindy, I think you have to organize a union. My mother's theory of organizing was to get somebody to do it. We never solve these problems. Think about anything that you've ever struggled with. Anything, right? You want to have better penmanship, you want to eat less, you want to exercise more. You don't exercise more by exercising one day. You have to get up every day and go exercise. This is what drives me crazy about exercise. If I could do it once, I would.
We have time for one more question. Hi.
Oh, hi. Shout.
I'm sorry.
We're going to take one from the balcony, sorry. Yeah, we can hear you.
As an educator in Pittsburgh, when I look at all the redevelopment that's going on, and forgive me if I'm not clear, because there's so many things that's running through my head with the dialogue and with the speech. But when I always look at the redevelopment, it's always economic redevelopment heavy. As George spoke, it's not always considering the people of the community. And I think a lot of times when we start redeveloping
As Ken Doino said, I live in a neighborhood called the Valley, which is a former manufacturing area. So there are a lot of abandoned factories, it's worker housing. It's a very poor area, and it's in the process of redevelopment. So Homewood, Hazelwood, The Hill, the effort is largely to try to move in people with money, and ultimately that is, even if it's not the intent, it's not the intent of our organization, but even if that's not the intent, it tends to displace the poor. What do we do about that? I have the great privilege of working with the next generation of organizers in my family, my daughter Molly Kaufman, who's an organizer at our Community Development Corporation, HANDS, Housing and Neighborhood Development Services. And Phil Hallen came to visit, the famous Phil Hallen of the convertible, and he said, look, here's what you gotta do. Get 15 really terrific youngsters and invest in them, and in 5 years they'll be on the city council. And Molly said, that's serious advice, I'm doing it. This year, working with a group of very talented emerging artists from the neighborhood, young kids who in high school developed a program. My mother riffed Maggie Inc. off Orange Inc., which is the youth program, developed this program, designed the studio where they hang out, have grown. They're now 5 years down the road. They're not high school kids learning art, they're young emerging artists. We have an annual festival which was pretty pathetic. But this year, the young emerging artists said, well, you know, we don't really have the energy to do a big festival. Thank God they didn't have the energy to do a big festival. They said, we'll do a mini festival. And so as kids, our kids, they said, let's have bands. And they started calling all their friends. And pretty soon they had 14 bands. And they said, let's have poets. And they started calling all their friends. And pretty soon they had 20 poets. I was one of them. And I was the older generation of poet. And they started saying to the artists, what will you do? And so there was an art exhibit, there was live mural painting. 800 people came to this festival 2 weeks ago. 800 people, youth, proud youth, dignified youth, youth who are going to be poised to be the leaders of our city in 5 years, just as Phil Hallen said. We develop them, we invest in them, we believe them, we listen to them, as George said. Molly and her coworkers listened to the youth. When the youth said, get bands, she's like, yeah, well, who do you know? She didn't get bands for them. They went out and got the 14 bands. We had the most fabulous music. The party started at 1 and it went on till 2 a.m. It was fantastic. I didn't quite make it till 2 a.m., but I was there pretty late. That's what we do. It's you know, if we can bring our love, and if we can bring our listening, and if we can bring our confidence that there has been a shift. We're not where we were. We're not where we want to be, but we're not where we were. We are talking to each other. You are here because you want to talk, because you want to listen. You are here because in your heart, you had some kind of moment of truth and some kind of moment of reconciliation that there has to be a better society in America. Otherwise, you would not have come in the door. You know what I'm saying is true. It's just maybe not a conflagration, but the smallest fire starts out as a tiny spark. As Margaret Mead said, never doubt what a small group of people can do. It's the only thing that ever has made change. The longest journey begins with a single step. And as my mother would want you to know, do all the good you can. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Kate.
Thank you all very much for coming and listening to this tremendously inspiring conversation that Mindy instructed us in. There's a reception in the lobby for all those who would like to stay and be able to continue the conversation, to meet with Mindy, to be able to meet new people. One quick observation, in response to the director of the Kelly Strahan Theater. She didn't even promote her own theater in East Liberty. But when you look at these pictures, and it's something we confront at the Design Center in our conversations in communities of 26 white men of power, part of the problem is that we tend to see the world through our own life experience, and we invest in our own histories. And I think one of the lessons from Mindy's talk is to start investing in each other's histories and see the world as other people are seeing it, and try to understand that they add a richness to our experience that we may never have had on our own. So with that, thank you, Mindy, very much for coming. The Design Center was honored and proud to host this, and all of our co-sponsors. We thank so much for bringing over 300 people to the August Wilson Center to hear Mindy Fullilove.